The Beatles, the Rolling Stones, Bob Dylan, the Easy Beats, Janis Joplin, Jimi Hendrix, The Who. These are some of the acts that made a particular decade of music more experimental and arguably more resonant than any other decade. The music business in the 60s was a kind of maelstrom of artistic creativity that was embedded in this frenzy of global turmoil.
Tell me about that relationship between music and social change during the 60s.
Well, you know, the green environmental movement, the women's movement, black rights, civil rights, gay rights, all these movements took hold in the 60s. And really music was a driving force in that entire social upheaval. Importantly, it was a time when young people really believed that they could refashion the world and how it operates. There was a common saying in the 60s, don't trust anyone over 30. Teenagers and 20-somethings had a very different view of the world as compared with their parents during the 60s, and music really helped define and reinforce that generational divide.
What about the changes that occurred in popular music during the 60s?
Yeah, well, the 60s was a period where rock audiences were really sympathetic to and actually demanded innovation. Everything seemed fresh and new, and they wanted newness. Much of this was driven by technological advances. Transistor radios, which came in the end of the 50s, stereo records were 60s, Marshall stack amplifiers allowed bands to be able to play outdoors, synthesizers and mellotrons, and of course, most importantly, multi-track recording really came into its own in the 60s. But the whole thing was also driven by a very specific zeitgeist, a sort of conscious avoidance of anything that could be construed as stale or unimaginative or retrograde. So you ended up with all these new genres. They were new then, they aren't new now, but genres like folk rock, heavy rock, psychedelic rock, progressive rock, garage, metal, jazz rock. So many of the genres that still exist today, they all came into being in the 60s.
What led you to write Freak Out?
Well, when I first started researching the 60s and its music, obviously, it was kind of a personal odyssey to see if I could rekindle the sort of excitement, the visceral thrill, if you like, that I used to experience when I listened to music in my youth, particularly my teens. But what I discovered, of course, was so much bigger and more amazing than my personal experience. The 60s was a truly seminal decade because popular music completely refashioned itself to become, at the time, the foremost artistic medium of that era. Rock and pop music was completely unparalleled in its global reach and its influence. And that's not to say that music doesn't resonate equally for many people today. But in the 60s, music had, particularly rock music, had much more universality. I mean, everyone listened to the Beatles, for example. And it was also the decade in which Australia came of age, when we finally stopped being a British colonial backwater and joined global culture. And really, popular music helped drive that shift.
And what can we learn from the 60s that has relevance to our circumstances today?
If you want to really understand contemporary culture or modern popular music, you need to go back to where it all began, from the Beatles to Led Zeppelin, civil rights, gay rights. The 60s were the decade that set the future in motion in many ways. Because for all its disruption and seeming divisiveness, it was also a time of great camaraderie. People worked together for a greater good. And that idealistic communitarian spirit of the 60s really contrasts with the selfishness and greed that began to take hold from the 70s onward. In the 60s, music provided an incredible connectivity between young people, both within their peer groups, but also that connectivity reached across entire oceans between continents. And that shared response to music was incredibly cohesive for young people because they felt they were some part of something that was much bigger than themselves, something world-changing and indeed magnificent. And today I think we need to find ways to reconnect with one another and to view ourselves once again as part of something bigger and more important than this constant focus on personal self-gratification. And if anything, that's the real lesson from the 60s.